Okay, welcome to the Stanford Digital Economy Lab Lunch Seminar Series. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and today's speaker is Michael Jacobides. Michael is the Sir Donald Gordon Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation and the Professor of Strategy at London Business School. His work appears in a number of top academic journals, such as the Strategic Management Journal, Strategy Science, as well as Organizational Science, Research Policy, Academy Management Journal, and others, including Industrial and Corporate Change, where he's a co-editor. He's worked on policy as a visiting scholar at the New York Fed and a member of high-level groups for the EU and the Industry Parliament Trust at the UK, and serves as the Chief Digital Economy Advisor at the Hellenic Competition Commission. We welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. If you're in the Zoom audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And for those of you here at Stanford, please just raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and you may want to repeat the question so the virtual audience can hear the question. So Michael, welcome to Stanford, and please tell us about assessing the impact of GenAI on the UK competitive.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and it's great to be here. Let me first of all give a bit of a background in terms of why this research happened in the first place. And by way of background, I think that GenAI, as we're focusing on GenAI in particular, is a historical anomaly. It is the first large-scale technology that has emerged without any real reason other than the fact that people are ambitious in it, and geeky engineers got inordinate amounts of money in order to create stuff that makes them happy and solves problems. Now, this is serious because in the history of evolution of technologies, we have the use cases of technologies that create the funds that motivate innovation, not here. We have people, because of the structure of the capital markets, that have found the funds. And if you look at that, it's the funds that make the products are the products that make geeks happy. They are assistants, they are sidekicks, they allow you to solve problems, but they don't really solve business problems, which has brought us to a very bizarre circumstance where everyone from consultants to companies has said, oh my God, this technology is impressive. I now need to go find a use case. Again, historically without any precedent, certainly for something as important as that. And the problem is that there's been so much excitement, and there is excitement because there's take-up, and there's take-up because it's made for individuals, and it's made for individuals because productizing was not a problem to begin with, and funding was absolutely extraordinary in terms of any historical comparison, that we are led with really novel circumstances, and also with something which, according to Gardner, is already at the top of the hype cycle. I think if it isn't at the top, it's going to be at the top of the hype cycle of 2024. Despite the fact that this is impressive technology, there's also a lot of hype. Now, what I want to look at is what implications that has for businesses, GenAI in particular. Now, if you take some of the recent reports that we saw, and here's one of the consulting reports, we're all going to be horribly rich. Now, unfortunately, the estimates, and I hate to say it, not only the ones that I'm sharing with you, but similar reports from investment banks are based on thin air. That they, if you look at the reality of it, they basically take use cases, they multiply by number of firms, they multiply by number of countries, they presume that they all will be adopted, and then, embarrassingly, they add them up saying it's profits, when, of course, this would need to have been competed away. It doesn't make sense. Why do we see that? Conflict of interest, because everyone wants to go out there saying, I got the great new thing, let's go and sell a heck of a lot of projects with GenAI. Regrettably, that leads to a very bizarre set of circumstances. And the circumstances are that there is an exaggeration about what GenAI can do. And the weird thing is that GenAI has the ability of doing things that are absolutely remarkable, but the claims that we see are also at the same time outlandish. Now, the problem with GenAI is that we don't have yet evidence because it is so recent and so not integrated into the productive process that we cannot have any decent sample that will allow us to extrapolate. Do we have any evidence? Well, we do if you go back in terms of AI, and a couple of years ago, 2021, we worked with the BHI at BCG and drawing on some of the good work, including from people in this room, in terms of the impact of AI. We saw, well, what is happening in terms of the productivity implications and, most importantly, the profitability implications of AI, and what are the things that perhaps we should be looking at. And if you think about AI, one of the non-controversial findings is that the impact is not so much on the level of profitability, but the profitability distributions. AI leads to more uneven profitability distributions and creates some winners and some losers. And one of the things that was interesting when we looked at AI itself was the way in which AI changed the competitive landscape and allowed some players to start altering the way that they added value, creating an interesting sort of dual role of companies that were working both on the infrastructure layer, the hyperscaling, the computing power that was needed, and the ability of integrating AI with the services that were offered, be that from the cloud or from the information layer that had significant potential competitive implications. And if you look at GenAI, what we're now seeing, and there was a really interesting report by the Competition Market Authority on the evolution of the market for LLMs, is that there is a concern that it will increase the inequality of profit distribution. What we don't have evidence yet, either on the policy side or on the strategy side, is where GenAI is going to have an impact. Because rather than thinking about the blanket thing that is going to be this wonderful innovation that will help lift all boats, which we kind of know, looking at historical precedent, is not going to happen, we should start looking a little bit more systematically at what are the implications, who stands to win, who stands to lose, and what are the bottlenecks. And this is what motivated this study that I'm going to be presenting, which was funded by the Regional Innovation Fund in the UK, and that we did primarily working with the Institute of Directors that was released about just under 2 weeks ago. What is it that we want to do? Well, that's part of a broader research agenda, which starts saying that the problem with GenAI is that we have been focusing too much on technology and too little in the things that make technology have an impact. So what we want to do, both with this study and with follow-on work, is to start thinking about how GenAI combines with stuff to drive performance, with stuff at two levels. At the level of the organization, what are the other things that need to combine with GenAI as we see differential levels of impact of GenAI, and at the level of the sector or the ecosystem, where regulation, perhaps unsurprisingly, will be seen to have an important role. What do we want to do? We want to refocus the attention away from technology and into strategy and the impact of this technology in terms of organizations, their performance, and ultimately society. And I think that we're going to be bound to see that there's going to be some disappointment from those who are blindly investing in terms of GenAI, while at the same time not being able to fully take advantage of the opportunity that the technology offers. The hope is to build a program of research that matters for practice, and that's why you're going to see an effort to try to combine the qualitative and the quantitative, and I'm going to be presenting it at a fairly general level. There are some slides in terms of the framing and the theory, but this is mostly the phenomenology in order to address an audience that I know is quite diverse in terms of the interest. And frankly, on a personal level, I think that this is important because it poses some questions about the value that we can add. The value we add as researchers, the value we add as educators, the value we add as advisors, as we're trying to create some more systematic basis. So that's the overall idea. And let me try to tell you what the research project I will be focusing on in today's talk is about. And that's for the work that we've done pretty much from December until May. And that was an interesting mix between qualitative and quantitative. We wanted to start understanding what is the potential impact of GenAI. How did we do that? We did that by looking at how people who were in leadership position in organizations could see and assess the impact that GenAI had already for them. And we also wanted to see what their expectations were. Now, you could say people and their expectations, they're going to be very unreliable. And the answer, perhaps, but they're going to be more reliable than uneducated guesses. And rather than thinking about whether they expect that it's going to be high or low, we're looking at the variance. So if this is rubbish, we would see white noise. The interesting thing is that we find some results that even if we try to push them out, and even if you want to kick them away and then say, is this perhaps an artifact? They don't. And these are things that gave us some interesting insights that we corroborated in terms of the qualitative. Let me try to describe what we do. We worked with the Institute of Directors, which is what the name says. It's the Institute of Directors, members of the Board of Directors in the UK that partnered with us to deliver this research. So we had 16 workshops. We had 6 workshops before the session, where we went in each vertical. We looked at groups of different industries, and we said, hey guys, what are the impacts of GenAI? How would you assess them? How would you measure them? How would you think about the impacts in order for us to start categorizing the types of impact that GenAI has? And then we also worked on creating a survey, and we had the usual pre-testing of the survey, and then we got the answers that I'll tell you, and we ran the results. Now, it didn't stop here, because what we wanted to do is not only sit back and then say, I did my bit, I have the answers in the survey, and I'll be able to make up some story and then say, this is my best possible explanation. But we wanted to expose the people who had given the most interesting answers and tell them, you wouldn't have known that there are some associations between the variables that you answered. We'll tell you what the associations are. Tell us what's going on. So speaking about causal mechanisms, we're actually going back to the qualitative in order to ask people what they think is driving this association, so that we don't have the arbitrary views of us as researchers who think that they're smarty pants and as such they can come up with what mechanism exists, but rather see whether we can draw again from the world of practice. And then we had some workshops when we synthesized that in order to see whether that makes sense. And finally, because we wanted to have some implications, A, for strategy, B, for policy, we translated what we found for policy and strategy implications to see, are these useful things? Will they be able to make a difference? Because that was part of the commitment that we had. Now, there's another interesting twist here, which is that in addition to the work that we did with the IOD, and that was the about 130 people who came in these 16 workshops, 13 actually workshops, and the 300 people who responded our fairly detailed survey, we also worked with one of the leading private equity firms. And the reason that we wanted to do that is we wanted to see whether companies that belong to a private equity organization that is much more aggressive in pursuing growth would show different patterns, because at least that's what the private equity firms expected. Spoiler alert, private equity still does not defy gravity, and the ambition and perhaps hopes that things would be dramatically different are not quite borne out. Maybe self-selection of those who responded the rest of the survey, can't know, but interesting factor. Now, let me tell you what we did for the survey. We had a number of variables that we looked at. We tried to figure out what people do, and then what are the things that they care about. But what to us was interesting was not only to characterize where you use GenAI and what do you use GenAI for and how satisfied are you with it, but also what are the things that are variables to the adoption, variables to the use, or what are the attributes that characterize your sector, so that we can start running some basic correlations in order to figure out whether there's rhyme and reason in the way that GenAI affects stuff. The slides will be available. You can see what the distribution of sectors were, as it was heavily based on London. Unsurprisingly, a lot of professional service firms, as they are very important to the economy of London, much less in the larger firms and manufacturing, and that would be an interesting follow-on project. There's some discussion now with the World Economic Forum, and we'll see in what other sort of settings we may be able to go get a sort of additional insight. Now, that's the context. Let me now start going straight into the findings. What did we find? Well, first of all, we found that, interestingly, both in the P and non-P sample, 38% of the firms do not use GenAI. What does that mean? 38% of the firms do not officially use GenAI, but people have their phones and their computers, and there's no corporate policy, but they have no policy of officially using it, which, by the way, is an interesting distinction, and what are the risks that that has for organizations. And you can think about that already giving you one interesting question: what explains those that do adopt and those that don't adopt formally? There is another question which is in rough categories, but we thought that if we did more than these rough categories, we would not really have much reliability, which has to do with what impact has GenAI had. Low impact, moderate impact, or high impact. Now, this asks a different question, and there you can start looking at the variance in terms of the type of impact that you see GenAI have, and then you can start saying, oh, okay, I can see what explains whether you are in the one category or not. P-backed companies do not defy gravity, as you see here. And it's interesting that those that are in P portfolio companies, if anything, have a smidge more in terms of the low impact and a little more in terms of not using GenAI. Partly it has to do with what sectors you're in, and what you will see here in terms of descriptive statistics is that there is a variance between different sectors in terms of those that use, that don't use. Perhaps unsurprisingly, financial services, because it's more regulated, do not officially use GenAI because they have issues of dotting I's and crossing T's, and that will take us to regulation, which is an important problem there. But it also gives us some variance, which we think is interesting. Let me go to the questions of why people would adopt or not. And what we find is output accuracy and potential bias that GenAI could have, as well as staffing and expertise, are the two most important features for those who do not adopt GenAI. And that is interesting because these are not symmetrically distributed among sectors. And then you can see why in some sectors where you really need to nail it and have it exactly right, you are going to be more reticent to have it, because even if it is potentially doable, it's something that you would that we would rather not do. And the other thing, I see a couple of hands, so let me just finish with the adoption before we go to the more cool stuff, is that there are things that matter. Let me just give you the punchline, which is that bigger firms are more hesitant, and they are more hesitant because they've got heavier processes. Smaller and micro firms are much more ready to experiment because they say, what do I have to lose? And they don't have things that keep them back. But at the same time, as we will see, they are the ones that may find it harder to implement or benefit from it. Let me take a breather here because I saw a couple of questions. Yes.
Mine is very brief. You mentioned before output accuracy. Is that output accuracy as perceived by the users, or output accuracy of
Correct. Correct. Concerns with output accuracy as perceived by the users.
So I work with some of the big consulting companies to talk with boards of directors in this country. And this is very different than the statistics we get. We get only like 18% that aren't actually officially using GenAI as an experiment. And in finance, it's 100%.
Well, it depends. It depends on which. The problem here is that it is on the advisory side of finance, as opposed to whether a bank is using GenAI in order to seek productivities. So here we have those who are in narrower PFS advisory roles and who are hesitant to use it within their own context, right? So what I would say is that banks and larger financial institutions are almost all using some versions of GenAI, whether it is for simple productivity gains from checking contracts in terms of a significant cost saving and so on and so forth. So this has to do with the nature of the focused advisory of the firms that we saw, right? And that's why I'm saying that this is going to differ given the nature of the firms that we have there. So I think that the percentages are not that important because they are very heavily dependent on context in terms of what they think that they are entitled to say or not. The very large firms, I think, are above the concerns with explaining why they use GenAI. What is a larger firm in our sample, which is a bit smaller, is more hesitant because they feel that they might find it difficult to justify in some of these regulated services. So I think there's a bit of a bimodal distribution if you take all the way at the top of the distribution there. Yeah, but I mean, I think that, again, because some of these answers in terms of the nature of adoption are very sample specific, I care much more about the variance than reporting a notion of truth that I would if I had a massive survey that I could have claims of generalizability, which is why I think these are a little bit entry stakes, and I want to move more into explaining the variance, precisely because I don't have a confidence that we can have a full representation in order to make assessments on here's my qualitative mapping of reality.
There are about 175 people online. Jeff Green would like to know how you define impact and how do you quantify impact?
This is self-assessed.
Yeah.
This is self-assessed. So the problem with GenAI is that the use cases that you have are so wildly different that I think it is very difficult to create any particular measure that is going to give you a good enough answer. Our answer to that is to allow people to self-report whether they see that it moves the needle or not in their own organization, and then to see whether there are patterns for those who feel that it is having a high impact versus not. So let me try to go in that because this is where I think the results start being interesting and have something to tell us over and above the distribution of the sample itself. What we see if you compare those that say that we have a low GenAI impact to the ones that have a moderate or a high GenAI impact is that pretty much everyone does reduction of costs, right? Fewer middle management, secretary, do the basic stuff that allows you to improve some of your processes. But what we see is that there is a clear difference in terms of these categories when it goes to increasing product service engagement between existing customers, and in particular, providing new revenue streams. So the focus from the cost to the provision of new revenue streams and anything that sort of starts looking like a business model is something that correlates. Now, I'm not saying that there is any sense of causation, and it may just be a question of maturation. But I do think that this clear difference that we see in those who perceive the impact being bigger or that perceive the impact of being smaller, that also can be found in upselling and cross-selling is interesting because it speaks to the different way in which you use it. Now, moving down into the different way in which you use it, we ask a different question. We've got about 15 different areas where you can be using GenAI, and in a moment I'll show you some statistics about them, but you can think about the count, right? It goes from 0 to, I think, 14. And then what we ask is, wherever you use it, whether you use it ad hoc or you use it regularly. So you can think about it as breadth and depth. And what you see is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the companies that see that it has a high impact are the companies that have got a not only broader set of users, a bigger number, but also, and in particular, looking at the difference between moderate and high, that they have a much deeper use, i.e. that they tend to use them systematically. And again, I think that this is interesting in terms of the extent to which we're simply tiptoeing or the extent to which we start integrating it in the process of the organization that is what may make the difference. Now, you can get some further intuition about that when you go further down. So if you start unpacking it more, we say, okay, what are the different areas that you're using it? And you think about sales and marketing, or cross-functional, which is anything from like writing emails or doing reports, all the standard stuff that you can do. And what you can see is that the differences that are most significant between those that see an impact and those do not are the ones that are closer to the core of the organization, where you don't only use it in order to write emails and to have nice PowerPoint slides and so on and so forth, but where it touches operations, by far the one where you see the biggest difference, where it touches IT and engineering, and where it touches risk and legal, and a little less so HR. So it has to do with the nature, depth, and also the nature of the types of things that you do. Now, what are the recommendations? And I'm putting a bit of an asterisk here because these are the tentative recommendations, and a little later I'll tell you what is the next stage for the research, because we wanted to say something that is potentially useful, but we are aware that there could be further issues that we need to investigate. The first thing that we think may be happening is that there is a combination of both hype and underuse of GenAI happening at the same time. The board may be sold at the level of the hype, but while they authorize budgets that would not be seen even in the dreams of most people who are thinking about what the next CapEx or IT budget would be, because there is no clear plan in the way that it can make a difference, you do not see a return on the investment that you get. So this is one potential issue that we think that organizations must want to think about. And there is a question in terms of whether you want to focus on the revenue generation and customization as opposed to cost reduction, and also favoring the depth over breadth. Now, this is tentative, and I told you it's tentative because, like research, it's a first cut, and we want to be able to give something a little bit more rigorous and consider whether there is a natural progression from low to high impact, or if there is a question of particular types of organizations that are better suited for particular types of leverage. And the second thing, which is something that also we don't see in statistics, not only focus on impact, but start thinking about ROIC. Because this is a technology that does stuff, but if we don't start thinking about the potential for it being able to pay itself, both in financial and in strategic terms, then we're not going to be able to make an advance, because this is what the cases need to be looked at, and then looking at industry context and then say, might it be the case that there are particular contexts in terms of the types of sectors or the types of business models that allow you to use GenAI in one setting or another? So lots of things that we want to start looking at the next wave of research now that we have looked at the first set of findings. Let me now shift from the way that you use GenAI to the differences in terms of sectors. And this is where I think the even more interesting results emerge. What we ask people to do is to give us a sense of what matters for them and their own organizations. So there are some things that may mean different things to different people, but are quite important, like patent recognition. So we ask people, how important is patent recognition for the success in your company? Why did I do that? Well, that was a bit of a cheeky question. I expected that patent recognition should be important. Why? Because GenAI is good at patent recognition. That's what it does for a living. And if patent recognition mattered, I kind of hoped that the way that it mattered would associate with the possibility of GenAI to have an impact. Now, there are differences in patent recognition across sectors, both across and within sectors, but this variance makes me think that this is not just white noise. And then we went and we had some further qualitative conversations to see, hey, does that make sense? Let me tell you what are now the dependent variables, because if the independent variable is patent recognition, we wanted as a dependent variable to look at the expectation of industry transformation. How did we unpack it? 3 variables. Variable number 1, what is your expectation that your industry is going to be disrupted as a result of GenAI? Variable number 2, to what extent do you think that GenAI may substitute for the output of your company or business model or sector? Number two, for me, is probably the first casualty that we will see in a systematic way as a result of GenAI, which is advertising that is already starting to feel the pinch. And I think that you will see it being even further pushed for a good number of reasons. And the question is whether GenAI will squeeze them. Question number three is a different question. It says, will GenAI allow you to unlock competitive advantage? So while the first two are largely at the level of the sector, the third one asks you whether you think that you will be able to benefit given what you have. Now, what I'm going to show you here is odds ratios. And it actually says where you have high expectation of pattern recognition. So pattern recognition is 4 or 5 out of 5. What is the odd ratio for each of the three variables? So if you have a high pattern recognition probability, your probability that you will think that your industry is going to be transformed is 70% higher than the baseline. It is very strongly associated. Similarly, with both the threat of substitution and the potential to unlock new distinctiveness. Think about how these two things correlate, and we generally see them correlate in our segment, because it basically says that those who are answering the survey think that the same things that will squeeze the sector, will lead to disruption, can also lead to opportunities for some firms to be able to benefit. This is another indication that suggests to us that GenAI is going to have a similar profile to AI, i.e. increase the heterogeneity of profitability, potentially challenging some sectors and the business models, but also making some companies stronger as a result. And these are the companies that expect to win. And by the way, these are the ones that are probably disproportionately likely to be answering the survey, because they are the ones that decided to invest the time to come to our workshops and waste 40 minutes of their time responding to the survey. Kathy, I think there's a question.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Yeah, could you ground what you mean by pattern recognition? I find that out in hyperspace, and I'm wondering what specifically you mean.
Well, I think that we have an explanatory thing in the survey, and we said, you know, how important is it for your competitive advantage to identify patterns in your sector? As simple as that.
Patterns of what?
This is what we left. Look, the problem is that if you apply it, that's what we looked at the level of the workshops. People had different answers, but most of them basically thought in terms of the patterns, that there are patterns in terms of what drives demand, what are the attributes that I need in order to satisfy my customers. So things that allow me to have an understanding of what the customer wants, which is the primary issue, and I will return to that because it goes to the second category.
Some sort of underlying causality, causal logic of how things work in my business.
I think that they were thinking about the things that will allow them to offer customization or identify new products or come up with new knowledge for those in professional service firms that they would be able to package and give to their clients. This is on the qualitative side what they said. And what I found interesting, again, when we were trying to float the idea, because these variables sort of came up in conversation about, you know, does that make sense, is that it made sense, and the types of canonical answers that we had in professional services were very different from the ones that we got in the communications and advertising, different from the ones that we got in terms of the industrials that we had, because we had groups in each of them. Each got it, and each translated it into a very different thing in their own setting, because the way that they create and capture value is different. So they kind of make sense of it, and the translation onto the specifics just differs on, I think, broad categories of economic activity, what the pattern there is. Let me go to the second factor that is really important, and this is the one that we could absolutely not make disappear whichever way we slice and like the data, which to me is really cool, which is the importance. We had three types of knowledge. We had tacit knowledge, we had technical knowledge, we had proprietary knowledge. So likewise, we said how important is tacit knowledge, and provided some explanations, proprietary knowledge and technical knowledge. And it turns out that proprietary knowledge is very strongly correlated with the expectation that GenAI is going to be disruptive, which I think is really interesting, and ex post facto makes a heck of a lot of sense, because you need the proprietary knowledge in order to both upsell and cross-sell, in order to identify what the patterns are and give something that will be your own competitive advantage. And that is interesting because all of a sudden it starts making us think about what are the complements to this technology. So rather thinking about what technology does, you start thinking about what the technology needs to combine with in order to together drive competitive advantage, so closer to the kinds of things, Kathy, that we are speaking about in sort of more of our usual sort of parlance. Let me not go to the specifics here, say that proprietary data varies across and between sectors. And then we started saying, well, what does that mean for companies? And the first cut is that it means that you want to think about how you can build your proprietary data or compensate for its lack. It means that you need to enhance your data management practices, invest in pattern recognition, and thinking about the way in which you can look at what GenAI can do to add value in terms of the useful complements. It also starts asking some interesting questions of policy. If we are concerned about a world where GenAI is going to make it more uneven, and if part of the policy consideration is, let's find a way of making this a more democratic world, might we want to think about democratizing some of the data? And rather than thinking about regulating the technology, regulating the nature and access of the data, or what is available and to whom, the policy questions that emerge are rather different. And it may be that what we want to resolve is, again, the bottleneck to the technology rather than trying to bang the technology itself, if this is our policy impact. You wanted to think about the adoption bottlenecks, and I'll speak about that at as-risk sectors. And again, it gives you a different way of thinking about the legal frameworks. Let me now move to another two features which give us some other sets of results that we think are interesting and that we will try to unpack. The other two things that end up being important are regulation, but here regulation at the level of the sector, and modularity. Why is this important? Well, first of all, what you will see here is something that perhaps might sound to be unexpected. And what might be unexpected is that the more regulation is important at the level of the sector, the greater the organization's AI ambition. We had a composite of ambition, impact, and adoption index. And the question is, why is there a positive correlation between regulated sectors and excitement with GenAI? The answer is, this is where the complicated stuff is. This is where GenAI is useful in being able to deliver impact. You can think about regulated things like scientific technical services or legal services or health. And the fact that they are regulated does not make them any less important in terms of GenAI. If anything, it's more fodder, more stuff that GenAI can do. And what we find is that there is an interesting relationship with the extent to which the products are modular. And this is a broader issue that we've also found out, which is that GenAI works when it can apply itself in a given module. When you've got a very big, complex, and integral service, GenAI cannot undo it because it needs to find ways of embedding itself within it. And the extent of modularity versus integrality and the way that that affects profit is one of the areas that we want to look at research more in the future. Now, this then starts giving you the possibility of unpacking the world and looking at it in different directions. Consider, for instance, this simple 2x2. And in this 2x2, what I'm looking is two different dimensions. One of them is the value to be unlocked, which is the extent of ambition that GenAI has at the level of the organization, at the level of the industry. And then another dimension, which is the view in terms of whether there are barriers for GenAI usage and implementation. You see one of the quadrants which is not terribly exciting, construction. People don't expect that GenAI is going to transform construction for a good number of reasons. You see then some others like information and communication, where people are fairly excited about the impact, but they say it's very easy to implement them. This is the stuff that we have all seen, computer coding, stuff that has already been documented, which interestingly are the things that will take care of themselves. Why? Because people see the benefits, they implement the benefits, they don't need to bother too much about it. Now, what you can see is that there are some other areas like education, health and social work, possibly to some extent financial services, where there is expectation for transformation, but at the same time, significant bottlenecks. Both from a policy perspective, and when we're speaking to the private equity firm from a private equity ownership perspective, we're like, guys, this is where you can add value. Because if you can resolve the bottlenecks that do not allow the technology to unleash the opportunities that exist, you're going to have an impact. So it starts again changing our view about what we can do in order to get these benefits in terms of GenAI, and how we need to take our own, the next steps in making things happen. So there's a number of recommendations that we had for business in terms of the way that you can tackle with regulation and modularity, but more importantly, the fact that you've got a slightly more sophisticated playbook for the way that you look at different sectors and how you can unleash the benefits of GenAI. It also suggests that at the level of policy, rather than thinking about blanket provisions about GenAI, you will need to have vertical focus, sector by sector, saying in each sector what's going on. And do I have regulations that facilitate or inhibit the impact of GenAI? Because this is where the value might exist. Now, I can take a bit of a step back and then speak about the connection to the literature and say what are going to be the interesting topics that we're looking in terms of the paper, but I'll leave that for later. I'm leaving it up there simply because I'd love to hear your views in terms of the framing, but let me finish this discussion in terms of the phenomenology, and if we have time, we'll go back to the different academic contributions that we hope to unpack from this paper. Let me tell you how we tried to put these things together, not from an academic perspective, but from a prescriptive perspective. And let me tell you what I think is the potential value add as we try to take our findings in context. What is it that this exercise tells us? This exercise tells us that we have been focusing, when it comes to technology, at the impact of GenAI tools whose ability is to interrogate data, but this is a small part of the value add. Now, the problem is that we have said, hey, look at this amazing ability of GenAI to do stuff and come up with answers. That is great, but that's not sufficient. That is not what is going to move the needle in organizations. Why? Because you have some important complements at the level of the organization. The first thing is that you have the issue of collecting data, of the data engineering, of figuring out what is true and what is not. Earlier on in our meeting, we were speaking about what is a truth and how you can actually train your model on what truth is. What is the data that exists? And not only do you need to then have something that gives you a reasonable output, but you need to embed this at scale in your own organization. Perhaps, Eric, goes back to some of your slightly more recent stuff in terms of the shift of decision-making and doing data-based decision-making. But if you look at the organizational reality of the way that you are taking GenAI, the problem is that it's a fancy toy that we see some organizations not being able to link in consequential ways in their operations themselves. Now, we need then two strategic capabilities: collecting the data engineering that goes with it, and the embedding of the data in terms of the integrating and scaling. In addition to that, we need two strategic assets, and these are the things that we have also seen as statistically important on the basis of our survey. The first thing is having the proprietary customer data, because proprietary customer data is a foundation that allows you to get many of the benefits that we see GenAI be able to achieve. So having the ability of accessing data, and if you don't have proprietary data, figuring out how you can make up for the deficiency of not having that in order to add value. And the final bit is the enriching of the data in terms of the knowledge base of the stuff that you have learned from your operations that you can leverage. Let me give you one example. L'Oreal, for instance, uses this database when it has to do with things that may be embarrassing, like hair loss or acne. You can go and they've got an AI-powered set of solutions that allows you to load your information, and they say, hey, we have 180,000 doctors in our system, and we've looked at all these cases, and not only will I now have the information about you, but I will have more data, and the data that you have provided me will increase my knowledge base, and my knowledge base will then become more attractive, and if it is more attractive, everyone will be able to come, because the flywheel will be able to work to my advantage. So rather than thinking about GenAI itself in isolation, I think that it is important to think about the full picture, and if you think about the full picture in terms of accessing, collecting, interrogating, embedding, and enriching data, link it to what do you want to do that for? Is it for cost and productivity? Is it for customer engagement? Or is it for new business models? And then from a strategy perspective, try to figure out what do you need to do in order to get to any of these potential areas of value add. And this is one example of how I think we need to shift from looking at the technology, at the context where technology works, in order to understand where promise exists and where disappointment may happen if we don't look at it. Yeah, Kathy.
Michael, yeah, this is very interesting. I was wondering, though, if you could make the distinction between machine learning, predictive AI, and generative AI, because a lot of what you said reminded me of the way in which one gains value using predictive AI. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing GenAI as very similar, very different, complement.
So two things to say about that. One, I think that the most interesting cases that I've seen of GenAI is a combination of GenAI and non-GenAI.
AI and machine learning mean?
What's that in terms? So let me give you one example. So I was recently in one of the meetings that the Wallenbergs have with all of these Scandi companies that they own. And one of their forestry companies was explaining what they have done and the way that in something that you said, forestry, which is not necessarily the most technologically advanced sector, they are using AI. And it turns out that it's a very complicated sector, and there's interesting ways in which you can manage the entire supply chain and do better predictive models of the different types of outputs that you need and so on and so forth. But their ability of leveraging GenAI only became a reality that had economic impact when their actual AI, where they could trust the data, came up to fore. Because then they started asking GenAI, what are the patterns? What else should we be thinking? What can we do? So again, it goes back to having some basis of information that allows you to combine the ability of GenAI, which is to think about some of the pattern recognition that exists in all manner of data, with some areas where you know that the data can be trusted, and combining the actual data that you can have in a traditional sense of AI with GenAI. So my personal view is that we will see an increasing importance of the combination of GenAI and traditional AI, because I think that that makes them more potent. I think that there is a way where I can see super additivity in the two. Also, that said, there are cases where you can see GenAI without the existence of an underlying AI model. And they can work in a substitute fashion simply because in some use cases, you need the functions and the features that GenAI gives you, but you don't have a need of doing traditional machine learning, either because you don't have items that need to be turned into sort of numerical assessments that then allow you to do the standard predictive analytics. So that's sort of the quick and dirty answer.
So is the way that it would work, let's say for this forest products company, is they would run GenAI and get some general patterns, and then you'd kind of nail the precision of those patterns with more machine learning?
It's almost the other way around. You get the data, and then on the base of the data, you can start being more creative because you have internal data and external data. What I think the question that I have, though, is what do you do with that? So let me try to go there by trying to see whether we can be a little bit more ambitious and I may go back to some of the qualitative observations that we saw. Let me give you this example. So 3 weeks ago, there was an event that SAP had organized, and they were saying what they're doing in terms of GenAI. One of the companies they worked with was Heineken, and Heineken has created something I think they just unveiled called Happy, which is this thing, which is a tool that allows wherever they are in the world to have all the information they need in terms of the markets, the profitability, internal stuff, external stuff. So it's this, it literally is, pardon my crudeness, the wet dream of someone doing knowledge management in the 90s, right? You really have all the information that can be accessed very easily, and it's a standard GenAI application that also requires some standard of truth. Now, they said, great, because this way we will have more information at the disposal of the organizations. And to me, that's interesting, but it's almost not ambitious enough. If you now have the ability of having information that can be trusted in a number of different ways, why do you not think about creating different entrepreneurial incentives that allow people to leverage the knowledge that they have and the fact that they don't need to be within their own narrow bounds in order to ambitiously think about what the organization can do? Now, that's on the upside. There are other questions about the way that we run our organization that relate to qualitative interviews, not something that we found on the quant side, but certainly on the qualitative side. What is it? Well, one of the things that we saw is that there was a bit of a meltdown of the supply and demand of well, for instance, in terms of HR, the way in which GenAI may affect the routines that we have in organizations. Let me simplify. If I were to look at this an assignment as an academic, or if I were to look at the set of decks as an advisor, I could, up until recently, figure out whether they're good or not. Why? Well, because the poor ones would have poor logical structure, they wouldn't make sense, they're to put together in a hasty way. So I used these quick shortcuts that I had as a way to assess quality. The problem is that with GenAI, everything looks profesh. Everything looks clean, clever, well thought through. And that is a problem. Because many of the things that we have done in organizations rely on these summary assessments, which right now are not quite right. So now what you need is some skills, which are new skills, skills that we need to impart as business schools, skills that we need to impart from kindergarten on for people who complement GenAI. So not only do you need to think about how do I take my organization and how do I take the opportunities that GenAI gives me to rethink how the organization is structured, I also need to think about how GenAI and the fact that stupid stuff masquerades as intelligent because it is written in a logically coherent way should be challenged, rethought, reconsidered, because unfortunately you can't quite rely on it anymore. It used to be the case that it was easy. It's not easy. That, again, asks interesting questions of organization. So how are you adapting to GenAI also means how are you changing to ensure that as GenAI changes the way that you operate, you are changing the way that you're adding value. So I think that the cool thing that we are starting to look with this work on in terms of GenAI is that it starts asking the bigger question. And since I mentioned organization, let me end with strategy and then just take the remainder of the time for any Q&A. I think that so far there has been a focus, perhaps an unhealthy focus, on use cases. And the use case is primarily on cost reduction, sometimes on revenue increase, but primarily, unfortunately, until now, on cost reduction. I think that we can do more than that. And I think that although I'm saying that there is hype and we will see disappointment, I think that we need to be more ambitious in the way that we leverage this technology. So I think that in terms of the strategic operations and process design, we need to not only think about the use cases, but think about the way in which GenAI can allow us to come up with new ideas and integrate this in the decision-making process of the organization and do it in a systematic fashion. Thinking about whether the processes that we have should be redesigned, combining AI and HR in new ways, given what GenAI does as a process. And again, that's a different agenda than the one that I've seen in practice so far. It also suggests that business models may change, may be challenged in terms of thinking about how you can defend from or expand revenues affected by AI, thinking about how you're going to be changing your positioning, and how the competitive landscape is going to change. And there are some areas that will change more quickly than others. There are some that are more defensible than others. Again, has to do with proprietary data, has to do with the other complements, but organizations need to think more carefully about that. And the final bit is strategic viability. And that's where I put my hat on as a co-chair of LBS's AI task force, because this is what I lose sleep over. What is the value that we bring as business education to the people who expect to be told how to complement what they have in their disposal in order to be successful? And I think that that, to me, opens up questions which are, on the one hand, technological, but on the other hand, deeply strategic and organizational, because this is where I think the biggest disconnect that I see is, and as we think about how GenAI will be able to transform our world, well, the answer is by transforming organizations and transforming sectors. And I think that the focus should start moving away from, hey, look at what we were able to do with this AI system or close to AGI, which is interesting, to move closer to how will that impact organizations and how will that affect their cost-benefit calculus, and what should we expect for society? And if we want to push this evolution, what are the bottlenecks that we can identify and resolve? So that's sort of the overview. And perhaps I will close by putting the academic questions, just for the fun of it, up there. But Eric.
Yeah, so this is an amazing data set, very, very rich, lots of people answering these questions. You know the names of the companies.
Yes.
So have you yet been able to connect it to external data on revenue, profitability, performance, other metrics, and or external data on the kinds of inputs?
This is really cool. Let me be entirely honest. Up until now, I mean, we had the public unveiling and, you know, interfacing with whatever parts of the UK government as well to put it all in their agenda. So we have not had the time to do that. So that's, you know, this is the first time that we're presenting it. So catching a breath, and the question is, what do we do next?
Another question about, you know, what high, medium impact. You know, it'd be interesting to see whether their own assessments of the effects correlated with any objective or external data, and to see how well that you could predict that.
Look, I agree. And what was interesting, so a small subpart of these people where we had a new executive education program, which I organized, the Next Generation Digital Strategies in LBS, where we had 29 people, mostly C-level execs participating, and whom we had asked to answer this questionnaire as part of the entry requirements, because, hey, we wanted the data and we wanted to feed the data back to them. And we had an interesting discussion of how the views would change after they became more sophisticated with technology. So we're going to be using a repeat use of the database of the questionnaire in order to see how people change their views. We have to look at external data. We're considering whether we're going to be re-administering and then seeing why people change their views. But again, combining quantitative and qualitative data. So there's a number of different directions. What is finite is time. So, you know, would love to hear from you. And I would love to get an email, whether from this room or from the number of people who are with us online, because this is the stuff that we're going to be working on for the next few months. So looking forward to learning from your reactions. Yeah.
Thanks. You started your talk by pointing out that this is kind of a unique situation because of the way AI was created without a particular purpose. A second way that maybe it's unique is in the comparison of time constants. So think about the time constant of an organization that's trying to decide whether to adopt a technology. And think about the time constant of the development of that technology. So in this case, AI is moving pretty quickly. How does that matter if the time constant for the technology development is actually faster than the reaction time of the organization? And if so, what is that?
This is a terrific question. The first answer is, of course it matters. But let me just sort of qualify that a little bit more. What I'm starting to see is that the problem is that changing some of the practices in order to adjust GenAI is costly. One of the interesting things that we heard, for instance, from one of the few large financial institutions, was to say, we're not firing people, but we're not hiring, and we are creating new stuff in a new way. So what you see is that it is much easier to put stuff together in new activities using GenAI than uproot the things that you have and try to change the processes and embed GenAI, which also suggests that there's going to be some pressure for digital native style or AI native style organizations. And I would almost have said it's a wonderful Schumpeterian world where we're going to see creative disruption. But that's not what's going to happen. Why? Because large organizations have the other complementary assets that are needed. And what we see in other bits of research, that's sort of the other things that we're looking at, is that there is a greater stability, and incumbents end up allying with smaller organizations to graft some of these things and hobble along, part inefficient, part efficient, absorbing technology where it has been developed usually by smaller companies like those that are issued out of people from Stanford and other leading places that are allowing it through a gradual grafting to evolve and adjust. But it's a super important issue.
So we have to stop there. I'm afraid we're over time, but let's have a round of applause for Michael coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that also wraps up our spring seminar series. We will see you again in the fall.
Thanks very much. Thank you.